Hi, I'm Wyatt Cash at Scoop News Group, and we're here at CyberTalks with Rob Lalumondier, Senior Director for Federal Civilian Business at McAfee. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Wyatt.
Well, let me start by asking, what does it mean to have a baseline level of cybersecurity in today's context in 2021?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of years on what it means to have a cybersecurity baseline. But I always like to think this minimum baseline is having like four key tenets or organizational buckets that all businesses and agencies should be really tackling and tracking throughout the progression. I think the first one is that you need to have a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy for incident response. Not only respond to incidents quickly and effectively, but also to continue to strengthen your organization's defenses against those incidents. I think that second tenet there is to take a hard look at threat sharing across your environment. Most organizations have pockets and offshoots and little regional and organizational pockets that they need to manage. And your architecture and your solutions you choose should really enable interoperability and create the ability to share intelligence at near real time across your enterprise. I think most importantly, they have to be relevant and timely to the cybersecurity threats and challenges that you're facing in your specific industry. And then I think, the third, I said there were kind of four tenets here. I think the third one is to create linkages between your technology environment and your policies. And I think this allows you to take practical first steps by implementing security best practices and then building them into your policy. For example, a lot of organizations are doing this, but I think it's important to keep tracking these things. Vulnerability assessments, system updates, your backups, inventory control, all of those things are critical for establishing that baseline. I think last, but certainly not least, creating a cyber smart workforce is just absolutely paramount. Nearly 98% of all cyber attacks still rely on some form of social engineering to deliver malware. And phishing emails and accidental password compromise and things like that are still very much a thing. I know we've been talking about this for a long time, but it's still a big issue. And it's imperative that we as cybersecurity leaders create training and certifications and organizational focus on those security basics.
Well, thanks for articulating those four tenets for our viewers. Next, let me ask, how would you say the pandemic affected the way that agencies are securing their data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think enterprises and agencies were and still are faced with this really daunting challenge of remote work. It was all over the tech media about how to serve remote workers in this challenging time. But the IT professionals are still quickly shifting workloads to the cloud and still trying to navigate all those compliance and security challenges that come along with like almost a nearly non-existent enterprise perimeter. And I think this is where zero trust, one of the big buzzwords we've been hearing lately, zero trust. I think this is where zero trust really comes in. It provides a more data-centric approach rather than trying to, focus on securing specific networks or hardware. In some of the high-profile attacks we've seen, nation states and organized crime are funding full-time research and zero-day exploits and the development of sophisticated ransomware. Once those attackers are in your networks, they have trusted status and can move throughout your network and micro networks to discover and steal data. But I think to their question, I think the good news is that enterprises are responding to this. They're implementing microsegmentation for internal infrastructure that has opened doors to SaaS applications. And we used to throw a ton of tools at on-premises problems. Tools like data loss prevention and encryption and file access controls. But these types of tools have largely not been implemented across most as-a-service clouds in a really organizational comprehensive way. So that's definitely one issue. And then we're also seeing this digital transformation driving a new wave of demand for additional endpoint protection to address new vulnerabilities, along with an EDR to provide real-time analysis and leverage AI for guided investigations of these attacks. So I think this focus on securing data rather than the infrastructure is a welcome response to the pandemic that we're going to continue to see well into the future.
Well, I know that the landscape for cybersecurity is always changing, but in light of some of the most recent high-profile incidents, Colonial Pipeline to mention just one, What kinds of changes do you expect to see in the cyber world over the next year?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking about zero trust, and I think we're going to continue to see that trend throughout the next 12 months. I think organizations are going to spend this next year adopting zero trust tactics and methodologies, whether they know it or not. But they're going to start focusing on heavily on the data traversing devices, clouds, and users. But overall, I think some of the biggest changes we're going to see in the next 12 months that we're all going to see in the news are around threats. I think there's going to be a huge uptick in attacks on personal devices that exploit mobile payment apps and rapidly adopted technologies. So just give you an example of QR codes that, we're all going to restaurants now and we use those QR codes to pull up the menu. And that is a huge threat vector that I think we're going to see in the future. And we'll see more exploits of technologies like that. On the enterprise side, I think we're going to definitely see a lot more copycat supply chain attacks, like the Sunburst campaign. The industry's been talking about these types of attacks for a long time, but I think we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We're starting to get more supply chain regulation coming from the government to protect sensitive data, and in private companies to protect trillions of dollars in intellectual property. And I think another big threat trend we're going to see is the continued rise of highly sophisticated cloud platform attacks. Cloud adoption for business services has been increasing by triple and even quadruple digit percentages. So we're seeing an even greater increase in attacks on those cloud accounts. So that, those accounts are absolutely goldmine for cyber criminals. Organizations with remote workers using unmanaged devices to access those applications are a huge risk. And especially when those cyber criminals just leverage a little bit of human intelligence to understand who their high value targets are. Those executives, engineers, IT professionals, just to name a few. And they take advantage of those weaknesses. And one I still hear all the time and I'm always completely flabbergasted by is reusing the same password for many accounts. So many people still do it, and it's such a huge threat to internal data security.
And lastly, Rob, what would you say is the biggest thing that you think most people don't really appreciate or understand about cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really one issue that's always really top of mind for me is the public's appreciation for how serious this cyber threat is. And the sheer number of cyber attacks that we see in the news on almost a daily basis in major publications, these attacks are occurring so often, and they're on such large institutions that I think we're sort of losing a full appreciation for the damage and potential for devastation, despite Colonial Pipeline, just to name one that was a huge issue for us. But I think we've grown a little bit numb to it. So I think it's hard to really rally public support around a faceless criminal. And with these attacks occurring so often, they become normalized, and we start to use really sterile words about them, like breach or compromise, rather than what they really are, which is crime. And I'll admit, even as an industry practitioner, I often kind of run under the size and scale of some of the crime that's involved. But I think people in our industry really, they do know how bad this next major attack could be. But it takes more than just us. It takes more than a small handful of cyber experts and IT professionals to prevent this sort of thing. We need to find better ways to scale messaging for cyber awareness and education to our coworkers, family, and friends, and help everyone really understand the role they play in preventing that next big cyber attack.
Well, Rob Lalumondier, thank you so much for taking some time to share your insights on the cybersecurity space and some of the things that we all need to be taking a look for and appreciating more seriously. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Wyatt.